too.
It happens to men too, you know.
It happens to men.
Do you want a point? It happens to men as well.
Men's.
Oh,
The men's.
yeah, okay.
If you have yet to have the pleasure of reading MP Jess Phillips' best-selling biography, hopefully you won't think it a massive spoiler if I reveal that she considers herself to be something of a champion for victims of domestic violence. Indeed, she rather modestly describes herself as probably one of the go-to voices in the world on the issue of domestic violence. But if your first impression of her was tainted by her exchange with Philip Davis MP over the prospect of a parliamentary debate on male inequalities, then it may come as something of a surprise to read that she cares about men who suffer domestic violence and wants to help them. That said, she's not entirely convinced by estimates that possibly 1 in every 3 victims could be male, and claims that during her time working in domestic violence services, only a handful of men ever approached her asking for help. Now, given her experience as a woman working as the business development manager for a women-only charity that only offers help to women, this is perhaps understandable. Indeed, in her capacity as one of the go-to voices in the world on the issue of domestic violence, she goes as far as throwing something of a gauntlet for anyone concerned about male victims who would like her support. Because in her chapter on the truth about violence, Jess Phillips invites those who care so much about male victims to create a movement, prove the need and the demand, get funding, at which point she'll gladly come and cut the ribbon. But in the meantime, don't ring up Women's Aid and talk about men, just like you wouldn't call cats protection and talk about parrots. So, even if the thought of Jess Phillips with a pair of scissors in her hand might cause Jeremy Corbyn some discomfort, I thought I would succinctly summarise a few recent developments so that one of the go-to voices in the world on the issue of domestic violence can hopefully crack on with those ribbons. Step 1. Create a movement. Well, anyone familiar with the origin story of the women's refuge movement in Great Britain might consider that suggestion a tad rich. But regardless, I'm pleased to advise her that there already is a movement championing the needs of male victims. After all, who do you think lobbied Parliament to recognise International Men's Day and succeeded despite one very loud and objectionable objection? For the uninitiated, the UK Men and Boys Coalition and the Mankind Initiative might be good places to start, and I'll include their details below the line. Step 2. Prove the need. Well, this one is easy because even if her sums may be a bit Diane Abbott, Jess actually does this in her book. The independent fact-checking charity Full Fact report that data indicates that approximately 700,000 men in England and Wales experience domestic abuse every year. That's out of a total of 2 million victims, which would mean that 1 in every 3 people that might potentially seek help from one of the go-to voices in the world on the issue of domestic violence could be male. But in fairness, levels of domestic violence are notoriously hard to measure, and in her book, Jess goes out of her way to poo-poo that 1 in 3 statistic. So we'll defer to her wisdom and simply ignore it. We could turn to the Crown Prosecution Service's Violence Against Women and Girls annual performance review, which reports that 1 in 6 victims of prosecuted crimes classified as violence against women and girls, such as sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking and forced marriage, are actually experienced by men and boys. But the last MP to point that out in Parliament was branded a misogynist. So instead, let's take Jess's own estimates that around 1 in 10 or 10% of victims will be male. According to Jess, there are 7 million victims annually, which would mean that every year around 700,000 men might be hoping that one of the go-to voices in the world on the issue of domestic violence doesn't cut them loose when lobbying for services. Step 3. Prove the demand. Jess claims that a domestic violence incident is reported in her area every 12 seconds. Now, it's generally understood that male victims are more reluctant to seek help from authorities, but if Jess's 10% estimate is remotely accurate, then that would mean that an incident involving a male victim is reported in her city every 2 minutes. But even if it's 1 every 5 minutes, or 1 every hour, or 1 every day, presumably one of the go-to voices in the world on the issue of domestic violence wouldn't just tell them to crack on if they contacted her constituency office, particularly on the day when the services of a specialist domestic violence support worker are available. Local authorities in Cornwall recently reported that 1 in 4 victims of crimes classified as violence against against women and girls in their area are in fact experienced by men and boys. I mention this because Cornwall is one of the few areas in the UK that has a domestic violence refuge that will actually accept men. To put that in context, there are currently no beds for men in any London refuge, where the Metropolitan Police recently reported an 80% rise in reported domestic violence against men. How many beds are currently available in Birmingham, I wonder? Step 4, get the funding. Well, that's where things get a little bit tricky. Funding is generally distributed at local authority level, and the Men and Boys Coalition recently wrote to all police and crime commissioners, urging them to remember male victims when applying for funds that the Home Office has ring-fenced to help victims of crimes classified as violence against women and girls. The Mankind Initiative, who support hundreds of thousands of male victims across the UK, receive no state funding whatsoever. Men's Aid, who take hundreds of calls from men in the Midlands area, are reportedly paid for out of private pockets. On the bright side, there is a publicly funded Freephone national domestic abuse helpline open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, but it is run in partnership with Women's Aid, and as Jess so eloquently put it, you don't ring up Women's Aid and expect to talk about men, and if you did, then they wouldn't talk to you, because it is a woman-only service. Except in Northern Ireland for some reason, where people presumably have different shaped ears, or heads, or hearts, or funding requirements. Instead, the Home Office funds a separate men's helpline service. In contrast to the 24-hour service available to women, that service is only available 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, when a lot of men will be out working. Oh, and calls are restricted to 30 minutes because of demand, and callers report inconsistent, limited or virtually non-existent referral options depending on where they live. I'm not sure who in this day and age you phone to get help from parrots, but in her book, Jess highlights the fact that apparently the public donate more money to donkey sanctuaries than they do to women's refuges, so you can imagine how male victims must feel. But on a less gloomy note, having hopefully now established that there is a need and a demand, not to mention a growing movement who want to see support for all victims of domestic violence, hopefully we'll get to see Jess cutting some ribbons very soon.